Hello students, welcome back. This is Dr. Mercado speaking. I hope all of you are doing well. This is going to be a continuation over Chapter 16, Job Order Costing. In this lecture, we are going to be covering Exercise 16-10. Make sure that we do read the chapter before attempting your problems. Now, this particular chapter deals with factory overhead. So it's very important that we read over the section that deals with factory overhead, the allocation of factory overhead, and the determination of the factory overhead rate. Okay, this can be found on pages 800 and 801 of your textbook. Okay, so let me jump in to exercise 1610. So it deals with predetermined factory overhead rate. So it says, exotic engine shop uses a job order cost system to determine the cost of performing engine repair work. The estimated costs and expenses for the coming period are as follows. And then they provide us with a list of different expenses for the shop. So we have engine parts of $380,000, shop direct labor of $1,872,000, shop and repair equipment depreciation $62,500, shop supervisor salaries $240,000, shop property taxes $36,940, shop supplies $10,000, advertising expense $28,000, administrative office salaries of $150,000, and administrative office depreciation expense of $8,000. So our total costs and expenses for the shop are $2,787,440. They're also telling you that the average shop direct labor rate is $37.50 per hour. We are being asked to determine the predetermined shop overhead rate per direct labor hour. Now, before we even start working or calculating, it's very important that we understand what overhead is. Okay, factory overhead is. So factory overhead basically includes all manufacturing costs except direct materials and direct labor. So if it's direct materials or direct labor associated with the factory, in this case, this is an engine shop. If it's direct materials or direct labor, then that is not overhead. Okay, everything else would be overhead. Now we have to be careful here because they're also giving us some administrative cost. These administrative costs do not fall within the actual how can I explain it, within the actual calculation of the making of the particular engines or whatever is it that they're manufacturing in this case. So factory overhead basically entails a different variety of things. The first one is indirect materials. So if you have indirect materials associated with the factory, that is overhead. Okay, and indirect materials are any materials needed to make a product but that are not directly traced to the product. Okay, we also includes indirect labor. This comes from salaries of production supervisors and the wages of other employees such as janitors. Indirect labor is any labor needed to make a product, but that is not directly traced to the product. So if it's not actually actual people working on the product, manufacturing the product, then it's not direct to the product. So if we have a supervisor that's just overseeing the production, then that's indirect labor. Okay, so that also falls under factory overhead. Okay, we also have factory utilities. This could be the power, the light, anything that is needed to keep the factory going. And we also have factory depreciation cost. Those are usually provided to the different areas by the accounting department, and that is the depreciation on the equipment being used for the production of the goods or the merchandise. Okay, so factory overhead is composed of indirect materials, indirect labor, any type of utilities, taxes, water, light, telephone, internet, anything of that nature dealing with the actual factory component, and then the factory depreciation of the equipment. Okay, so those are your factory overhead items. Okay, so let's get started. They're first asking us to determine the predetermined shop overhead rate per direct labor hour. Okay, before we do that, okay, we have to calculate the estimated shop overhead as follows. Okay, so we have to identify from the list provided here what is overhead. Okay, so the first thing we have is the shop and repair equipment depreciation. Okay, that's one of the things that is part of your overhead. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to highlight, I'm going to mark it off, that way I know that I've used it, okay? So the shop and repair equipment depreciation falls under overhead. So let's put that in. Shop and repair equipment depreciation. 62,500. Okay. What else? Well, we mentioned that if it's a supervisor salary, that's considered indirect labor. So we have a shop supervisor salary, so we're going to include that as well as our overhead. Okay. That is not directly associated with the manufacturing. The supervisor didn't actually make any engines or anything. They were just supervising. So that's indirect. Okay. Shop supervisor salaries. That's 240,000. Okay. We also have the shop property taxes. Okay. We need the shop to be able to manufacture our goods, but it's not directly associated with manufacturing anything per se. It's just an expense. It's kind of like a utility expense. We have to pay the taxes every year for the shop, so that's an overhead cost. So we have the shop property taxes of 36,940. Okay. And then we have shop supplies. Okay. This could be any supplies that were used, maybe cleaning supplies, anything to keep the shop in order. These supplies were not used to manufacture any of the engine components. It's just shop supplies used in general. So those are indirect materials. Okay. So we have shop supplies, $10,000. So now we can calculate our total shop overhead. Okay. So we add those together. And that gives me 349,440. Okay. Now it's important to know that the engine parts, I'm going to make a little note here. The engine parts and the shop labor are direct to the jobs and are not included in the shop overhead rate. Those are your direct materials and direct labor. Okay. The advertising and administrative expenses are selling and administrative expenses that are not included in the shop overhead but are treated as period costs. Okay, so our administrative expenses are treated as period costs. Okay, that's just a side note, that way we know why didn't we not include those up here. On the overhead, we just include indirect materials, indirect labor, and any indirect costs associated with the shop. Okay, so once we've calculated our total shop overhead, we can go ahead and calculate the estimated activity base. Okay, and that is being calculated using the direct labor hours. Okay, so let me see. Okay, right here. Okay, so let me put here the estimated activity base is determined by dividing the shop direct labor cost by the direct labor rate. Okay, so my shop direct labor cost, the total was $1,872,000 right here. That is my shop direct labor cost. That's how much I spent in labor during this period. Okay, so we have 1,872,000. Okay, let me just put this 1,872,000, and I'm going to divide that by how much is my labor rate. Well, according to the problem, your average labor rate is $37.50. Okay, so we get 1,872,000 divided by 37.50, and that gives me 49,920 hours. Okay, so we approximately invested 49,920 hours of labor during this period working on these engines. Okay, so now we know the number of hours that were invested during the period. Okay, then last but not least, we're able to determine the predetermined shop overhead rate. Okay, and then in order for us to be able to determine the factory overhead rate, well, we know that the overhead, the amount of overhead that we had, the cost of overhead was $349,440, which we calculated in step number 1. Okay, your total shop overhead. Okay, let me just mark that. So this is coming from over here. Okay, so we had calculated that we had overhead costs of $349,440, and we are going to divide that by the number of hours that we invested during the period, and we invested 49,920 hours. Okay, and that is coming from over here. Okay, so then that gives me 349,440 divided by 49,920. That gives me $7 per direct labor hour. So what does that mean? That means that for every hour spent making these motors or engines, whatever it is, for every direct labor hour that is spent, and I'm spending an average of $37.50 per hour. So for every hour invested in the making of these engine parts, I am going to assign a $7 overhead cost to the different products. So if it takes me 3 hours to make an engine, then it's going to be 3 hours at $37.50. So let's say it takes me 3 hours. This is just an example. So it's $37.50, and it takes me 3 hours to make an engine. That'll be $112.50 of labor, and then on overhead it'll be $7 per hour times 3. Then I'm going to assign $21 of overhead with that. That way you can have your direct materials, direct labor, and overhead. There's 3 components when we're calculating our manufacturing costs. So you've got your labor, you've got your materials, which are very straightforward. Okay, the one that's a little bit more complicated or challenging is your overhead. How do I assign my overhead? Well, in this case, they've decided to assign overhead based on direct labor. We calculated our overhead rate based on that, on the labor hours, and then we're able to say, you know what, for every hour of labor, I'm going to assign $7 of overhead to that specific item. Okay, so that is the different calculations for this second problem, which is determining the factory overhead rate based on direct labor hours. Okay, so that would be my second, that concludes my second lecture. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me. Make sure that you read and that you do listen to those short lectures posted on the actual assignment in Cengage. They're also very useful. And don't forget to review the different examples provided to you in your ebook. There is just a wealth of information provided on your textbook. Please utilize it to be able to complete your assignments. Okay, so that is it for this lecture. Until next time, have a great day.